Welcome to the latest Chicken Bites series with international trade expert Dr. Martin Cameron. Martin is a quantitative economist with extensive experience in international trade and energy economics. He joins us today in the first episode of this podcast series to discuss South Africa's export performance, emerging trends, and key trade barriers in this sector. Thank you for joining us today, Martin. Providing an overview of South Africa's current export performance, what are the key sectors driving growth and what are the emerging trends?
Sure, Jennifer. I think, there's growth and then there's what we call trade-weighted growth. So growth would simply be irrespective of the size of the particular product or sector's contribution to the economy, whether that grew. And we see that there's some very esoteric and interesting little sectors and products that have been growing since between 24, 23 period. Interesting, meat and edible meat products is actually one of them. So while it's not a large export in the bigger scheme of things, it has grown strongly over this period. And also essential oils, and then some other agricultural raw type of materials, vegetable, textile fibers, etc. So if we turn our attention to the more important sectors in terms of their relative contribution to the exports is also large, and we then weight the growth with that size of the contribution of that, then we're seeing that vehicles, automotives is a major, by a factor of more than double the next product group, that has shown growth over the last year, and followed by citrus products. And we know, especially in recent times, since last week, there's a lot of focus on international trade with the US. And we know that part of that is oranges, and a big component of that would be oranges associated with the USA and AGOA and Europe and other markets. And then we have some minerals after that, more precious metals, and in some sense, wine, essential oils. So a lot of agro-processing involved in the top groups. And then we do see the meat kind of popping out at the end of the group, or if you look at the top 10, including also, interestingly enough, some pharmaceutical products. So those are the major drivers of growth between 2024 and 2023. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next coming months with all the international changes and geo-economic shifts that's happening with the US announcements from last week.
What are the most significant trade barriers currently hindering South Africa's export potential?
Well, again, this type of topic is not so straightforward because there are internal, self-inflicted trade barriers. So if you point the fingers to other countries, three fingers are pointing back at South Africa. And then there are the target market, barriers. So maybe we should focus, because the most significant of these barriers are actually at this point in time, probably the three fingers pointing back at South Africa. And it is much more than just trade. It's the general business environment, because obviously in the end, what is traded are businesses running and producing their activities and products, and that is what you want to trade in the end. So if your business environment is a challenge, then obviously it will have the knock-on effect into exports as well. And I think in no order of significance, but all equally contributing and important to a operating space where businesses can efficiently, produce and conduct their activities. I think institutional weakening of law and order in South Africa is a challenge. We have complicit policing. For instance, if you look at what happened with the riots in KZN, there were examples of vandalism and theft inside of the harbor, where containers were stolen and fuel depots raided, etc. And that cannot happen if you don't have complicit accomplices on the inside. Same goes for some of the trucks that are hijacked along the roads, etc. in many of the cases, the police are implicated. So that is a challenge. And if you don't have a trust and confidence in the rule of law and the enforcing agencies, then you have uncertainty and challenges in the operating environment. Then the well-known energy challenge, although we have only recently seen some load shedding over weekends, etc., the reality of the matter is that we have a twofold energy crisis brewing in South Africa. The one is the well-known Eskom blackouts, and that has not gone away. It's not going to go away soon. The reality is that the infrastructure is very old. It was left too long, and I think I'm predicting that we will see more of that coming again in terms of blackouts. The simple reason why we've been fortunate so far is, although there were some actions to try and revive some of the elements of the system, the saving grace of the system was the decline in energy demand. And also, some of the activities have shifted onto photovoltaic and other alternative energy, generation technologies, such as rooftop solar. And in the mines, etc., they've also started investing in alternative energy sources. But when the economic activity picks up again, we will very quickly run into the constraints from an electrical energy perspective. But then there's, I mentioned too, there's also the liquid energy in terms of fuels. And what, especially in trade, what is important is you need to be able to move your goods. And that generally takes mostly diesel. And the challenge that South Africa has is that we've actually lost 3 of our refineries in the last number of years since 2020. And we only have Natref left, and the kind of the writing is on the wall for that as well, meaning that we now are much more exposed to imported final product, and that brings its own challenges in terms of the global developments, as well as logistics. As an example, to get the fuel into South Africa, there are key points where this fuel can be transferred from shipping to South Africa. And if anything goes wrong there, then we are stuck. Then we can't get the fuel into the country. Even within the country, we have continuous, back to my point of policing and rule of law, we've continuously have theft and orchestrated, call it if you like, mafia operations that taps the petrol pipelines, that raids and hijacks fuel trucks, etc. And all of this have a knock-on effect on industry. So we should not underestimate the potential for South Africa to run into trouble as a result of the liquid fuel challenges that we are potentially facing. And to give you an idea, according to the minerals regulations, we are supposed to, or Department of Energy, we're supposed to have about 60 days worth of fuel in the system. At any point in time, when you look at the system, there's nowhere close to 60 days worth of fuel available in the country. So the moment we start having some hiccups in the supply, we're going to run dry in certain areas within hours and days. So that for me is a big concern. Then transport infrastructure, roads and bridges, the lack of maintenance. Recently there was a report last year I think it was in June, July, where Joburg Roads Agency admitted that 702 of the 902 bridges are in very poor condition, to the point of OUTA, the Organization for Undoing Tax Abuse, went and actually had experts evaluate those bridges, and 25% of the bridges were deemed to be unsafe to cross. And as we speak, people are driving across those bridges in their cars and trucks, etc. So that is a worrying kind of development that we are seeing in the infrastructure. And this is just the example where, some research and investigations were done and reports were produced. It's much broader and much wider in the rest of the economy. And that, again, if we talk about trade, is a key enabler or disabler if your physical infrastructure to move the goods is starting to fall apart. And you see, companies close down, relocate, or even leave the country as a result of that. The most recent example that was quite in the media around that was that Clover closed the factory in Lichtenburg in the northwest province to relocate to KZN because the municipality could not deliver the physical maintenance of and support in terms of physical infrastructure, roads, water, electricity, etc. Then we get to the port. Now, the port in an export and import transaction is where 80% of the time goes, typically, of moving your goods. So if your ports are slightly underperforming, it's got a huge knock-on effect on any transaction. And as we saw with COVID as an example, there are many knock-on effects that can happen if people are simply not available at the port to do their jobs. Then suddenly the containers can't be offloaded, and that's got a huge knock-on effect, both domestically on the import side as well as on the export side, taking it to your target markets. And in the latest Container Port Performance Index that was released last year, also about June, South Africa's ports were ranked the worst performing in the world. Not one of the worst, the worst. Cape Town ranked last.
Wow.
Coega ranked second last. And then there was a gap. This was in position 405 and 404. And then Durban was at 398 and Port Elizabeth at 391. So we were literally the last and second last, and then within the worst 10 performing ports in the world. Now, this index actually evaluates real world data. There's been a lot of hoo-ha in the media in the last, from Transnet's perspective, and saying that, but the way that these indices are calculated, it's not good for South Africa if we look so bad because we don't agree with the methodology, etc. The point is that this index actually look at the vessel calls. 182,000 vessels globally are monitored, and they calculate from 2.38 million ship transactions, moving of containers on and off ships. How long it takes, what disruptions are, observed in those processes and associated with the different ports, etc. And so it's not, I don't agree with the methodology type of argument. This is basic facts, simply keeping track of the movement of the boxes on and off the ships. And in that sense, it's really an indictment for our infrastructure and performance in South Africa, that we are the worst. In some cases, you find that some of the shipping lines are not even willing to stop in Cape Town, as an example, or in Durban to drop off a box. They'll, for instance, go past and go and first deliver the majority of their consignment of containers, for instance, in the Far East. And then depending on what the situation is on their way back, they may come and drop the South African boxes. So our consumers, our businesses have to wait sometimes 3 months, 6 months for their consignment to be delivered to South Africa, not because the ships are not available and the services aren't running, but because they don't want the rest of their journey to be impacted by our port performance. And then we don't even talk about the export side. I mean, as an example, during COVID, some of the farmers had to load their stock onto trucks and take it all the way from the Western Cape up to Namibia to get it out, because Cape Town was in such a bad state in terms of performance. So that is really, one of those big three fingers that are pointing back at South Africa.
Thank you for joining us in the first episode of the podcast series with Dr. Martin Cameron. Be sure to catch the next episode, in which we discuss bilateral trade benefits as well as policy recommendations that could improve and strengthen South Africa's trade relations.